They swept across continents like a storm, rewriting the map of the medieval world with hooves and arrows. But behind the legends of Genghis Khan and thunderous invasions lies a quieter story of icy yurts, endless horse rides, and nights under star-choked skies. Tonight, we unravel the full story of the Mongol Empire, not just its brutal conquests, but how they slept, rode, ruled, and reshaped history, all before dawn. If your mind's too restless to sleep, let's gallop through the steps of history at a gentler pace. Subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss these calming stories that ride through time. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you? It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. You might imagine that the story of history's greatest conqueror began with some dramatic flourish. But the truth about Temujin's early years is far more tedious and bureaucratically complex than any Hollywood interpretation would suggest. Born sometime around 1162, medieval record-keeping being what it was, historians still debate whether it was 1155, 1162, or Yaya Lotse. Temujin entered a world defined not by grand gestures, but by the mundane realities of tribal politics, marriage negotiations, and the endless administrative headaches of managing nomadic confederations across the Mongolian steppes. His father, Yasuge, was a relatively minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, a position that required him to spend most of his time engaged in the thoroughly unromantic business of negotiating grazing rights, mediating disputes over stolen horses, and maintaining the complex web of marriage alliances that held steppe society together. The Borjigin were neither the most powerful nor the wealthiest clan on the steppes, but they had developed a reputation for administrative competence, trait that would prove far more valuable than martial prowess in the long run. In 1171, when Temujin was approximately 9 years old, Yasuge embarked on what was essentially a diplomatic mission disguised as a family trip. He was taking his son east through dangerous Tatar territory to the lands of the Kondrad tribe to finalize a betrothal agreement between Temujin and a girl named Bert. This wasn't romance. It was political alliance building of the most practical sort. The Kondrad were known for producing beautiful women, but more importantly, it controlled crucial trade routes and had extensive grazing lands that could provide economic security. For the Borjigin, the betrothal negotiations themselves would have been excruciatingly detailed affairs, involving discussions of bride price, grazing rights, mutual military obligations, and the precise terms under which each clan would support the other in times of conflict. Medieval steppe diplomacy was essentially a complex form of insurance policy, with marriages serving as the collateral that guaranteed good faith between potentially hostile groups. Yasuge would have spent days haggling over the specific number of horses, sheep, and cattle that would change hands, the seasonal migration routes that would be shared, and the military service obligations that Temujin would owe to his future in-laws. But on the return journey, the administrative precision that characterized steppe politics suddenly gave way to the brutal realities of tribal warfare. Yasuge stopped to share a meal with a group of Tatars, the same people who had killed his own father years earlier. Whether this was an attempt at diplomatic reconciliation or simply the customary hospitality required between travelers on the steppes, we'll never know. What we do know is that the Tatars recognized Yasuge and saw an opportunity to eliminate a potential rival. They poisoned him, not with some exotic substance, but probably with something as mundane as spoiled mare's milk or contaminated fermented beverages. Yes, death created an immediate administrative crisis for the Borjigin clan. In steppe society, leadership wasn't simply hereditary. It required the active consent of the clan's adult males and the ability to fulfill the complex obligations that came with chieftainship. A clan leader needed to adjudicate disputes, organize seasonal migrations, maintain relationships with allied tribes, manage the distribution of grazing lands, and coordinate military responses to external threats. 9-year-old Temujin was obviously incapable of handling these responsibilities. The clan's response was predictably bureaucratic in its cold efficiency. Rather than maintain the fiction that a child could lead them, they simply abandoned Holen, Temujin, and his siblings. This wasn't unusual cruelty, was standard administrative practice. The Borjigin couldn't afford to support non-productive members during the harsh steppe winters. And they certainly couldn't follow a leader who lacked the political connections and military experience necessary to protect them from rivals like the Merkits, Teashad, and Tatars. Holen was left to manage what was essentially a one-woman refugee crisis. She had to care for 4 young children: Temujin, his brothers Gigi Kasar, Kokagin, and Temuj, plus his half-brother Begtur, with no tribal support, no established grazing rights, and no formal alliances to provide protection. The family retreated to the Khenti Mountains, where they survived by foraging, fishing, and hunting small game. This wasn't a romantic return to nature, was grinding subsistence living that required constant attention to practical details like finding clean water sources, preserving meat through the winter, and avoiding the territories controlled by hostile tribes. The administrative challenges of survival consumed their daily lives. Holen had to organize hunting and gathering expeditions, ration food supplies, manage the family's few remaining animals, and somehow maintain the education and training that would prepare her sons for eventual leadership roles. She had to teach them the complex genealogies that determined clan relationships, the intricate protocols of steppe diplomacy, the practical skills of horse management and archery, and the economic knowledge needed to evaluate livestock, negotiate trades, and manage tribal resources. The psychological impact of this administrative abandonment on young Temujin cannot be overstated. He was witnessing firsthand how quickly political alliances could dissolve, how easily established authority could be overthrown, and how essential it was to maintain personal control over every aspect of one's organization. The lesson that would stay with him throughout his life was that political stability required systematic administrative control, detailed record-keeping, and the ability to manage complex networks of loyalty and obligation. This early experience with organizational failure and administrative chaos would later drive his obsession with creating systematic, centralized governmental structures that could survive leadership transitions and external pressures. But in the immediate term, it created a family crisis that nearly ended the future conqueror's story before it truly began. What mundane administrative detail would ultimately save Temujin from permanent exile, and how would a dispute over something as trivial as stolen fish reveal the character traits that would eventually reshape the world's political landscape? The incident that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of Temujin's life began with something as mundane as a fishing expedition gone wrong. During one of their foraging expeditions along the rivers of the Khenti Mountains, Temujin and his half-brother Begtur caught several fish, a valuable protein source for a family surviving on the margins of subsistence. But Begtur, exercising what he considered his rights as the elder brother, simply took the fish for himself without regard for the family's agreed-upon sharing system that Holen had established to manage their scarce resources. This wasn't a momentary tantrum by hungry children. It was a fundamental challenge to the administrative authority that held their small refugee band together. In steppe society, resource distribution was governed by strict protocols that determined everything from grazing rights to the allocation of captured livestock. Begtur's casual dismissal of these protocols represented a direct threat to the organizational structure that Holen had painstakingly created to ensure their survival. Temujin's response killing Begtur with arrows was certainly extreme, but it demonstrated his early understanding that administrative authority had to be enforced, sometimes violently, to maintain group cohesion. Holen's reaction to this fratricide reveals the complex administrative challenges facing steppe families. Her famous rebuke, "You destroyers. When we have no friends but our shadows, no companions but our tails, how can you do such things to each other?" wasn't just maternal anguish, but a practical assessment of their political situation. The family's survival depended on maintaining internal unity, while gradually rebuilding the network of alliances and obligations that would eventually allow them to rejoin mainstream steppe society. The killing of Begtor also had immediate practical consequences that required careful administrative management. Word of the incident spread through the various tribal networks, creating both opportunities and dangers. The Taishid, who had been keeping a watchful eye on Yasugi's surviving family, saw Temujin's actions as evidence that he might eventually pose a threat to their own political interests. They captured him and held him in what was essentially administrative detention, unimprisonment in any modern sense, but a form of supervised custody, designed to prevent him from organizing any challenge to their authority. The details of Temujin's captivity reveal the mundane realities of steppe justice and social control. He was fitted with a wooden collar called a kanga device that prevented him from lying down comfortably or feeding himself easily, essentially making him dependent on his captors for basic survival needs. This wasn't torture in the dramatic sense, but rather a practical administrative tool, designed to make escape difficult while allowing the prisoner to remain relatively healthy and capable of work. The Taishid weren't trying to break Temujin's spirit. They were simply managing what they considered a potentially dangerous political asset. But the administrative systems that trapped Temujin also provided the opportunities for his escape. The Taishid, like all steppe tribes, had to balance surveillance with practical necessities like seasonal migration, tribal gatherings, and religious festivals. During one such festival, when the tribe's attention was focused on ceremonial obligations rather than prisoner management, Temujin managed to slip away from his guards. Even then, his escape required careful navigation of the complex social networks that characterized steppe society. His liberation came through the intervention of Sorgan Shira, a minor member of the Soldu clan who was attending the Taishid festival. Sorgan Shira's decision to help Temujin wasn't motivated by friendship or sympathy, but by a careful calculation of political advantage. The Soldu had their own grievances against Taishid leadership, and supporting Yasuge's son represented a potential investment in future political change. This kind of strategic alliance building was the fundamental currency of steppe politics. Every favor created an obligation. Every obligation generated future opportunities for mutual support. The administrative details of Temujin's escape and subsequent return to his family illustrate the complex information networks that connected even the most marginal groups in steppe society. Sorgan Shira didn't just hide Temujin and send him on his way. He provided detailed intelligence about Taishid search patterns, safe routes through rival territories, and the current political situation affecting the various clans that Temujin might encounter on his journey home. This kind of information management was crucial for survival in a political environment, where the balance of power could shift rapidly based on seasonal migrations, marriage alliances, and military conflicts. Upon his return to his family's refuge in the Khenti Mountains, Temujin found that his mother had continued the painstaking work of political rehabilitation. Through careful management of their family's remaining assets, primarily their knowledge of tribal genealogies, their connections to various clan networks, and their reputation for administrative competence, Holon had begun to rebuild the social capital that would eventually allow them to rejoin mainstream steppe society. She had maintained correspondence with various distant relatives, mediated minor disputes between neighboring families, and gradually established the kind of reputation for reliability and competence that made other groups willing to consider political alliances. The next crucial step in Temujin's rehabilitation came through his marriage to Bert, the Konjurad girl to whom he had been betrothed before his father's death. This wasn't a romantic reunion, but a complex political negotiation that required careful attention to the changed circumstances of both families. The conjurat had to decide whether alliance with Kuei's critically weakened son still offered sufficient advantages to justify the investment of a daughter, while Temujin had to prove that he could provide the military protection and economic support that such a marriage alliance demanded. The wedding itself was conducted according to traditional steppe protocols that emphasize the administrative aspects of tribal alliance building rather than any personal emotional connection between the bride and groom. The ceremony included detailed negotiations over bride price, grazing rights, mutual military obligations, and the specific terms under which each clan would support the other in times of conflict. Dae-sechin, Bert's father, demonstrated his confidence in Temujin's future prospects by providing a valuable sable coat as part of the dowry, a gift that would soon prove crucial to Mujin's next phase of political development. But this marriage alliance also created new administrative challenges and opportunities. Bert brought with her not just personal loyalty, but connections to the extensive conjurat network of traders, herders, and minor political leaders. These connections provided Temujin with access to information about political developments across the steppes, opportunities for trade and resource acquisition, and potential military allies for future conflicts. However, these benefits came with corresponding obligations. Temujin now owed military service to his in-laws, had to respect conjurat territorial claims, and needed to coordinate his political activities with their strategic interests. How would this young man, still struggling to establish his basic political credibility, manage to transform these modest family connections into the foundation of history's largest contiguous empire? And what role would an expensive sable coat play in launching the administrative revolution that would eventually stretch from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean? The sable coat that Dae-sechin had provided as part of Bert's dowry represented far more than wedding finery. It was essentially a diplomatic credential that would allow Temujin to approach Togrul, the Khan of the Karaites, and request admission to the complex network of tribal alliances that dominated steppe politics. In the rigid social hierarchy of medieval Mongolia, such an expensive gift demonstrated that Temujin was backed by a family of sufficient wealth and political standing to warrant serious consideration as a potential ally. This single piece of clothing would unlock political opportunities that had been closed to him since his father's death. Togrul, whose Christian name was Khan, controlled one of the most sophisticated political organizations on the steppes. The Karaites had developed administrative systems that allowed them to coordinate the activities of multiple tribal groups across vast territories, manage complex trade relationships with sedentary civilizations, and maintain military forces that could respond quickly to threats or opportunities. Their success wasn't based on superior martial prowess, but on their ability to create and maintain organizational structures that could adapt to the fluid political environment of the steppes. When Temujin presented the sable coat to Togrul, he was essentially applying for membership in this administrative network. The coat served as collateral for future obligations, evidence that Temujin had the resources and connections necessary to fulfill the military service. Information, sharing, and political support that alliance with the Karaites would require. Togrul's positive response wasn't based on personal affection for Yasuge's son, but on a practical assessment of the political advantages that such an alliance might provide. The administrative challenges of maintaining tribal alliances in the fluid political environment of the steppes required constant attention to detail and systematic information management. Togrul needed to know the current military strength of potential allies, their existing obligations to rival groups, their territorial claims and seasonal migration patterns, and their ability to provide reliable military service when needed. Temujin's presentation of the sable coat initiated a careful evaluation process that would determine whether the young Borjigin leader could meet these requirements. But this alliance-building process was soon tested by external events that required immediate military response. The Merkits, one of the largest and most aggressive tribal confederations on the steppes, decided to settle old scores with Yasuge's family by kidnapping Bert. This wasn't simply a matter of personal revenge, was a calculated political move designed to humiliate Temujin and demonstrate that he lacked the military resources necessary to protect his own family, much less serve as a reliable ally to other groups. The Merkit raid on Temujin's camp revealed both the vulnerabilities and the opportunities created by the complex political networks of the steppes. The attack succeeded because Temujin lacked the intelligence-gathering capabilities and early warning systems that more established leaders maintained to protect their territories. But the Merkit aggression also provided him with a legitimate cause for military action that would allow him to test his new alliance with Kurs. Woo-la-loo-la-la-la-loo, woo-la-la, woo-la-la-la-la, woo-la-la-la, woo-la-la-la, chy, most walla-see, wall-la-la-la-la-la. But woo-la-la, ch, su-la-la, la sect, by woo-la-las. It's said, it's commute, which is stupsilide. It's condisciply, t.la, we are conbrood, by we are lie, we are na la plessid, we are on la like so we not a greppen remea me sessica cads it got casset it secret kit as a kit beast to with that to be easily to the gutta it sit up but lay losses help to this that with the it's up Togrul while demonstrating his own leadership abilities to potential followers. Organizing a response to the Merkit raid required Temujin to navigate the complex protocols of steppe diplomacy while managing the practical logistics of coordinating military action across multiple tribal groups. He had to send messengers to Togrul requesting military assistance, coordinate with his blood brother Jamuka, who controlled significant military resources of his own, and organize his own limited followers into an effective fighting force. This involves detailed planning regarding routes of advance, coordination of cavalry movements, distribution of captured livestock, and post-battle administrative arrangements. The successful rescue of Birate in Itenibai Joshiyi marked Temujin's emergence as a significant political player. But it also created new administrative challenges that would test his organizational abilities. The alliance that had defeated the Merkits now had to be managed on an ongoing basis, with careful attention to the distribution of captured resources, the assignment of territorial claims, and the maintenance of political relationships that would support future military cooperation. These weren't dramatic moments of conquest, but mundane tasks of political administration that required systematic attention to detail and careful management of competing interests. More importantly, the campaign demonstrated Temujin's understanding of the administrative principles that would eventually allow him to create and maintain the world's largest empire. Unlike traditional steppe leaders who relied primarily on personal charisma and temporary coalitions, Temujin began to develop systematic approaches to intelligence gathering, military organization, and political control that could function independently of his personal presence. He established regular communication networks that kept him informed of political developments across the steppes, created standardized procedures for incorporating defeated enemies into his military forces, and developed administrative systems that could manage the complex logistics of coordinating large-scale military operations. The break with Jamuka around 1187 or 1193 provided Temujin with his first major opportunity to implement these administrative innovations on a significant scale. The split occurred when retainers from both camps clashed over horse thiever, exactly the kind of mundane dispute that regularly disrupted steppe alliances. But rather than treating this as a temporary setback, Temujin used the crisis as an opportunity to systematically recruit the tribal leaders, who were dissatisfied with Jamuka's more traditional approach to leadership. The process by which 41 tribal leaders abandoned Jamuka to join Temujin reveals the administrative advantages of systematic organization over personal charisma. These leaders weren't attracted by Temujin's battlefield prowess or his personal magnetism, but by his proven ability to create organizational structures that could provide long-term security and prosperity for their followers. Temujin had demonstrated that he could maintain stable alliances, coordinate complex military operations, manage the distribution of resources fairly, and create administrative systems that could adapt to changing political circumstances. His election as Khan by this coalition of tribal leaders marked the beginning of the administrative revolution that would eventually transform the political landscape of Eurasia. Unlike previous steppe confederations that had been held together by temporary agreements and personal relationships, Temujin began to create institutional structures that could function independently of any individual leader. He established systematic procedures for military recruitment, resource distribution, conflict resolution, and political succession that would allow his organization to survive and prosper even through leadership transitions and external pressures. The decimal military system that Temujin implemented represented a fundamental break with traditional steppe military organization. Rather than relying on clan-based units that reflected existing tribal loyalties, he organized his forces into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 that cut across traditional tribal boundaries. This wasn't just military efficiency. It was a systematic approach to breaking down the clan loyalties that had prevented previous attempts at steppe unification. But what administrative innovations would allow this system to expand beyond the traditional boundaries of steppe politics and eventually encompass sedentary civilizations that operated according to completely different organizational principles? And how would Temujin's bureaucratic revolution ultimately transform him from a minor tribal leader into Genghis Khan, the ruler of history's largest contiguous empire? The transformation of Temujin into Genghis Khan wasn't accomplished through dramatic battlefield victories or inspirational speeches, but through the methodical implementation of administrative systems so mundane that most historical accounts barely mention them. The famous Kurultai of 1206 that proclaimed him Great Khan was essentially a bureaucratic reorganization meeting a gathering of tribal administrators, military quartermasters, and clan accountants who spent weeks hammering out the detailed organizational structures that would govern the new Mongol Confederation. The ceremony itself, with its elaborate protocols and religious observances, was largely theatrical. The real work happened in countless smaller meetings where participants debated tax rates, military service obligations, and administrative hierarchies. The decimal system that formed the foundation of Mongol military organization represented a complete break with the traditional clan-based structures that had governed steppe society for centuries. Instead of organizing warriors according to their tribal affiliations, family connections, or personal relationships with individual leaders, Genghis Khan created a systematic hierarchy based purely on mathematical principles. Every Mongol male between the ages of 15 and 70 was assigned to a unit of 10 arban, which was combined with 9 others to form a unit of 100 jagan, which joined with 9 similar units to create a regiment of 1,000 Ming Na, which was grouped with 9 others to form a division of 10,000 Tumen. This reorganization required an enormous amount of bureaucratic work that had never been attempted on such a scale in nomadic society. Administrators had to conduct detailed censuses of the entire Mongol population, recording not just the number of fighting men in each tribe, but their ages, their physical capabilities, their existing military experience, and their family obligations. They had to create new identification systems that could track individual warriors as they moved between different units, develop record-keeping procedures that could maintain accurate rosters despite the constant movement characteristic of nomadic life, and establish communication protocols that could coordinate the activities of units scattered across thousands of miles of steppe territory. The practical challenges of implementing this system were staggering. Traditional steppe societies had never required systematic record-keeping on this scale. Most tribal groups had operated according to oral traditions and personal relationships that made detailed documentation unnecessary. Creating written records for hundreds of thousands of individuals required the development of new administrative technologies, including standardized forms, filing systems, and bureaucratic procedures that could ensure accuracy and consistency across the entire confederation. Genghis Khan's solution to this administrative challenge reveals the systematic thinking that would characterize all of his organizational innovations. Rather than trying to create an entirely new bureaucratic system from scratch, he recruited administrators and scribes from the sedentary civilizations that bordered the steppes. Curite Christians who had learned literacy from Nestorian missionaries, Khitan nobles who had served in the Liao dynasty's bureaucracy, and Tangut merchants who maintained extensive commercial records all found themselves recruited into service as the clerks and accountants who would make the decimal system function. In practice, the administrative structure that emerged from this bureaucratic revolution was more complex and sophisticated than anything that had previously existed in nomadic society. Each unit in the decimal hierarchy had clearly defined responsibilities for maintaining equipment, providing supplies, managing livestock, and coordinating with other units. Company commanders, leaders of 100-man units, were required to submit regular reports on the condition of their men, their horses, their weapons, and their supplies. Regiment commanders, leaders of 1,000-man units, had to coordinate these reports into comprehensive assessments of their overall military readiness and forward them to division commanders, who compiled empire-wide intelligence summaries for the Khan's personal review. But the decimal system was about much more than military organization. It represented a fundamental transformation in the administrative relationship between rulers and subjects in nomadic society. Traditional steppe leaders had governed through personal relationships and temporary coalitions that could dissolve as quickly as they formed. Genghis Khan's decimal system created permanent institutional structures that bound individuals to the state rather than to particular leaders or tribal groups. A warrior assigned to a specific arban remained in that unit regardless of changes in leadership, tribal politics, or personal conflicts with his immediate superiors. This institutional permanence required the development of comprehensive legal codes that could govern the relationships between different levels of the administrative hierarchy. The famous Genghis Khan's law code wasn't primarily concerned with dramatic crimes or punishments, but with the mundane, bureaucratic slight procedures that would keep the decimal system functioning smoothly. Most of its provisions dealt with administrative responsibilities, reporting requirements, disciplinary procedures, and the protocols for transferring authority between different levels of command. The legal framework established by the Yasa reveals the systematic attention to detail that characterized all of Genghis Khan's administrative innovations. The code specified the exact procedures for conducting military censuses, the standardized forms that had to be completed when warriors were transferred between units, the disciplinary measures that could be imposed for various administrative infractions, and the appeals processes that could resolve disputes between different levels of command. These weren't the dramatic pronouncements of an autocratic ruler, but the careful work of administrative specialists who understood that systematic governance required detailed attention to bureaucratic procedures. The implementation of this legal and administrative framework required the creation of an entirely new class of professional bureaucrats who could manage the day-to-day operations of the decimal system. These administrators, drawn from various tribal backgrounds, but unified by their training in the new procedures, became the backbone of Mongol governmental organization. They maintained the records that tracked individual warriors through their military careers, managed the supply systems that kept units equipped and provisioned, coordinated the communication networks that allowed commanders to maintain contact with their subordinates, and supervised the training programs that ensured consistency in military procedures across the entire Confederation. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of the decimal system was its approach to merit-based advancement. Traditional steppe societies had been dominated by hereditary elites, whose political positions were determined by birth rather than ability. Genghis Khan's administrative revolution created systematic procedures for identifying and promoting talented individuals regardless of their tribal background or family connections. Unit commanders were evaluated based on standardized performance criteria. Promotions were awarded according to documented achievements, and leadership positions were filled through competitive processes that emphasized administrative competence rather than social status. This meritocratic approach to administration required the development of sophisticated evaluation procedures that could assess the performance of officials at every level of the hierarchy. Commanders were required to maintain detailed records of their unit's achievements, their administrative efficiency, their success in training and equipping their men, and their ability to coordinate with other units during military operations. These performance records were reviewed regularly by higher-level officials, who used standardized criteria to determine promotions, transfers, and disciplinary actions. How would this complex administrative machinery adapt to the challenges of governing sedentary populations who operated according to completely different economic, social, and political principles? And what bureaucratic innovations would be required to manage an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe? The expansion of Mongol authority beyond the traditional boundaries of the steppes created administrative challenges that required fundamental innovations in governmental organization and bureaucratic procedure. Each conquered territory brought with it established governmental systems, legal codes, economic structures, and social hierarchies that had evolved over centuries to meet the specific needs of sedentary civilizations. The Mongol decimal system that had proven so effective for organizing nomadic military forces was completely inadequate for managing agricultural populations, urban commercial centers, and the complex supply chains that sustained settled societies. Genghis Khan's solution to this administrative challenge reveals the pragmatic flexibility that would characterize Mongol governance throughout the empire's expansion. Rather than attempting to impose nomadic governmental structures on sedentary populations, he developed a dual administrative system that allowed existing bureaucracies to continue functioning while integrating them into the broader framework of Mongol imperial organization. This required the creation of new categories of officials who could serve as intermediaries between nomadic military commanders and settled civilian administrators, along with the development of protocols for coordinating policies across radically different administrative systems. The conquest of the Western Xia Kingdom in 1209 provided the first major test of this administrative approach. The Tangut rulers of Western Xia had developed sophisticated governmental institutions that managed irrigation systems, coordinated caravan trade, collected taxes from agricultural communities, and maintained diplomatic relationships with neighboring powers. These administrative structures were far too complex and specialized to be replaced by the relatively simple organizational systems that worked for nomadic societies. Instead of dismantling them, Genghis Khan chose to co-opt them by incorporating existing Tangut officials into a new hybrid administrative framework. This integration process required detailed negotiations between Mongol military commanders and Tangut civilian administrators regarding the specific procedures that would govern their ongoing relationship. Tangut officials had to learn new reporting requirements that would keep Mongol commanders informed about local conditions, while Mongol administrators had to develop new oversight procedures that could monitor the performance of civilian bureaucrats, without disrupting the delicate administrative systems that kept agricultural communities functioning. These negotiations often took months to complete and required the development of new administrative forms, communication protocols, and accountability procedures. The bureaucratic complexity of managing conquered territories is illustrated by the detailed records that survive from the Mongol administration of northern China. Following the defeat of the Jin dynasty in 1234, rather than the relatively straightforward organizational charts that had characterized the original decimal system, the administrative structure for governing Chinese territories involved multiple overlapping hierarchies that coordinated military command, civilian administration, tax collection, judicial proceedings, and diplomatic relations. Each of these functional areas required specialized administrative personnel who understood both Mongol governmental principles and the traditional Chinese bureaucratic procedures that continued to govern most day-to-day administrative activities. The tax collection system that the Mongols developed for governing sedentary populations reveals the administrative sophistication that imperial expansion required. Traditional nomadic societies had relatively simple economic structures based on livestock herding, seasonal migrations, and occasional raids that generated tribute from weaker neighbors. Sedentary civilizations, by contrast, had complex economic systems based on agriculture, manufacturing, commerce, and the intricate financial relationships that connected urban centers with rural communities and distant trading partners. Managing these economic complexities required the Mongols to develop new categories of administrative specialists who could assess agricultural productivity, monitor commercial transactions, calculate tax obligations, and maintain the detailed financial records that modern governmental systems require. These officials, recruited primarily from the educated classes of conquered territories, had to master both traditional, local administrative procedures and the new reporting requirements that integrated their work into the broader framework of imperial governance. The decimal system that had worked so well for organizing military forces proved completely inadequate for managing the civilian populations of conquered territories. Agricultural communities were organized around seasonal planting and harvesting cycles. Craft production was structured according to guild hierarchies and apprenticeship systems, and commercial activities followed trade routes and market networks that bore no relationship to military organizational charts. Rather than trying to force these diverse economic activities into the rigid categories of the decimal system, Mongol administrators developed parallel civilian hierarchies that could coordinate with military command structures when necessary, while maintaining the flexibility required for effective economic management. This parallel administrative structure required the development of new communication procedures that could coordinate policies between military and civilian authorities without creating conflicts over jurisdiction or resources. Military commanders retained authority over all matters related to defense, conquest, and the maintenance of imperial security, while civilian administrators were given responsibility for tax collection, economic development, judicial proceedings, and the provision of governmental services to settled populations. The boundary between these areas of responsibility was often unclear and required constant negotiation between officials who operated according to fundamentally different administrative principles. The administrative challenges of imperial expansion are particularly evident in the detailed census records that the Mongols maintained to track the population and resources of conquered territories. These censuses were far more complex than the simple military rosters that had sufficed for organizing nomadic forces. They required systematic surveys of agricultural productivity, livestock holdings, manufacturing capacity, commercial assets, and human resources that could provide the detailed information necessary for effective tax collection and economic planning. Conducting these censuses required the development of new administrative technologies, including standardized survey forms, professional census takers who could travel safely through potentially hostile territories, and data management systems that could compile and analyze information from sources scattered across thousands of miles. The resulting records provide an unprecedented view of the administrative sophistication that imperial governance required, revealing the extent to which Mongol success depended on bureaucratic innovation rather than simple military conquest. The legal challenges of governing diverse populations under a unified imperial system required equally sophisticated administrative solutions. The yasa that had served as an effective legal code for nomadic communities was completely inadequate for managing the complex legal relationships that characterize sedentary societies. Issues like property rights, commercial contracts, inheritance laws, and civil disputes required specialized legal expertise that could navigate the intricate precedents and procedures that had evolved within each conquered territory, rather than attempting to replace these established legal systems with nomadic alternatives. Mongol administrators developed a multi-tiered judicial structure that allowed local legal traditions to continue functioning while ensuring that imperial interests were protected. This required the training of new categories of legal officials who could interpret local laws according to imperial policy guidelines, along with the development of appeals procedures that could resolve conflicts between different legal systems operating within the same administrative territory. But even as these administrative innovations allowed the Mongol Empire to expand far beyond the traditional boundaries of nomadic political organization, they also created new sources of institutional instability that would eventually threaten the empire's survival. How would the complex bureaucratic systems that enabled conquest and expansion adapt to the challenges of long-term imperial governance? And what administrative reforms would be required to manage the succession disputes and regional independence? Movements that would ultimately fragment the world's largest empire. The establishment of Karakorum as the administrative capital of the Mongol Empire in the 1230s represented the culmination of the bureaucratic revolution that had begun with the decimal military system. Unlike the mobile camps that had served as temporary administrative centers during the conquest period, Karakorum was designed as a permanent governmental complex that could house the specialized bureaucracies required for managing an empire that stretched from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean. The city's layout reflected the administrative principles that governed Mongol imperial organization, with separate districts for military command, civilian administration, diplomatic affairs, religious oversight, and the complex logistics systems that kept the empire functioning. The central administrative complex at Karakorum housed the various governmental departments that coordinated imperial policy across the vast territories under Mongol control. The military administration maintained detailed records of unit deployments, supply requirements, personnel transfers, and operational planning that allowed commanders in distant provinces to coordinate their activities with overall imperial strategy. The civilian administration managed the complex tax collection systems, economic development programs, and governmental services that sustained the empire's diverse populations. The diplomatic department coordinated the extensive network of ambassadors, trade representatives, and intelligence agents that maintained relationships with neighboring powers and monitored political developments throughout Eurasia. But perhaps the most innovative aspect of the administrative architecture at Karakorum was the systematic approach to information management that allowed imperial officials to maintain effective oversight of territories thousands of miles from the capital. The famous Yam postal system that connected Karakorum with provincial administrative centers was far more than a simple message. Delivery Service was a sophisticated information network that provided the central government with detailed intelligence about local conditions, potential security threats, economic developments, and the performance of regional administrators. The operational details of the Yam system reveal the administrative sophistication that imperial governance required. The network consisted of more than 1,400 relay stations positioned at regular intervals along major routes throughout the empire. Each station was staffed by professional messengers who maintained detailed logs of all communications passing through their facility, along with support personnel who managed the horses, supplies, and equipment needed to keep the system functioning. Station commanders were required to submit regular reports on their operational status, the volume and types of messages they were handling, and any security concerns that might affect the reliability of communications in their area. The messages that traveled through the YAM system weren't limited to simple orders from the central government to provincial administrators. The network carried detailed intelligence reports from regional officials, economic data from tax collectors and customs agents, diplomatic correspondence with foreign governments, and the routine administrative communications that coordinated policies across different governmental departments. This constant flow of information allowed central administrators to monitor conditions throughout the empire and respond quickly to emerging challenges that might threaten imperial stability. Managing this information flow required the development of sophisticated administrative procedures that could process and analyze the enormous volume of data that flowed into Karakoram daily. Specialized clerks and analysts sorted incoming messages according to subject matter and priority level, compiled regular intelligence summaries for senior officials, maintained comprehensive databases of information about conditions in different regions, and prepared the detailed reports that informed policy decisions at the highest levels of imperial government. The administrative challenges of coordinating policies across the empire's diverse territories required equally sophisticated solutions. The four major khanates that emerged from the division of Mongol territories in the 1260s, the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East, the Golden Horde in Russia and Eastern Europe, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia governed populations that operated according to different economic systems, legal traditions, religious practices, and cultural expectations. Maintaining imperial unity while accommodating this diversity required administrative flexibility that could adapt general imperial policies to local conditions without undermining the overall coherence of Mongol governance. The tax collection systems that sustained imperial finances illustrate the administrative complexity that this diversity required. Each khanate had to develop revenue collection procedures that could effectively extract resources from their specific territorial base while contributing to the imperial treasury and maintaining the military forces needed for defense and expansion. In China, this involved complex negotiations with established bureaucracies that had centuries of experience managing agricultural taxes, commercial duties, and the tribute systems that connected the imperial government with local communities. In the Middle East, it required working with Islamic legal traditions and commercial practices that governed relationships between rulers and subjects according to religious principles that had no nomadic equivalents. The administrative records that survive from the Yuan dynasty in China provide detailed insights into the bureaucratic procedures that made this complex system function. Chinese administrators working under Mongol oversight had to master new reporting requirements that integrated their traditional record-keeping practices with imperial information management systems, while Mongol officials had to learn enough about Chinese administrative procedures to provide effective oversight, without disrupting the delicate bureaucratic relationships that kept the Chinese governmental system functioning. This required constant communication between different levels of administration and regular training programs that helped officials from different cultural backgrounds work together effectively. The legal systems that governed imperial administration reveal similar complexity. The Yasa continued to serve as the basic legal framework for military affairs and relationships between different levels of Mongol administration. But civilian legal matters were generally handled according to local legal traditions that varied significantly between different regions of the empire. This created complex jurisdictional questions that required careful coordination between different legal systems and the development of appeals procedures that could resolve conflicts between competing legal authorities. Religious administration presented equally complex challenges that required systematic solutions. The Mongol tradition of religious tolerance that had served them well during the conquest period became an administrative necessity as the empire expanded to include populations, practicing dozens of different religious traditions. Rather than trying to impose religious uniformity, imperial administrators developed policies that granted tax exemptions and governmental protection to religious institutions while requiring them to register with imperial authorities and submit to basic oversight procedures that ensured they weren't being used for subversive political activities. The administrative architecture that emerged from these various innovations created governmental institutions that were more sophisticated and effective than anything that had previously existed in world history. The combination of nomadic organizational flexibility, sedentary administrative expertise, and systematic information management allowed Mongol administrators to coordinate policies across territories that encompassed dozens of different ethnic groups, languages, religious traditions, and economic systems. This administrative achievement was arguably more significant than the military conquests that had created the empire, since it provided the institutional framework that made long-term imperial governance possible. But this administrative sophistication also created new sources of institutional vulnerability that would eventually threaten the empire's survival. The complex bureaucratic systems that enabled effective imperial governance required constant maintenance, periodic reform, and careful coordination between different levels of administration. As the empire matured and the original generation of Mongol administrators was replaced by officials who had grown up within the imperial system, questions about succession, reform, and the adaptation of imperial institutions to changing circumstances would create the political crises that would ultimately fragment the world's largest empire. What administrative failures would prove most destructive to imperial unity? And how would the bureaucratic innovations that had enabled conquest and expansion ultimately contribute to the empire's division and decline? The image of Mongol warriors sweeping across the steppes like an unstoppable natural force obscures the mundane reality that their military success depended on meticulous logistics planning and systematic resource management that would challenge the organizational capabilities of modern military establishments. Every Mongol campaign was fundamentally an exercise in supply chain management, requiring detailed calculations of fodder requirements, water sources, equipment, maintenance schedules, and the complex coordination needed to keep tens of thousands of horses and men moving efficiently across vast distances while maintaining their combat effectiveness. The basic logistics of Mongol military organization began with the horses that made their mobility possible. Each warrior maintained 3 to 4 mounts, which meant that a typical tummen of 10,000 men required between 30,000 and 40,000 horses just for basic transportation and combat operations. But these figures represent only the most visible portion of the logistical challenge. Each horse required approximately 25 pounds of fodder per day when grazing was insufficient, along with adequate water supplies that could amount to 1,012 gallons daily during intensive operations in dry climates. A single tummen operating in territory with limited natural forage would require 375,000 to 500,000 pounds of supplemental fodder every day, plus up to 400,000 gallons of water. Managing these requirements across campaigns that might last for months or even years required systematic planning that began long before any military force left its base territory. Mongol quartermaster, department staffed by administrators, recruited from sedentary civilizations that had experience with complex supply systems, conducted detailed surveys of planned campaign routes to identify water sources, evaluate the quality and availability of natural forage, locate areas suitable for establishing supply depots, and calculate the additional resources that would need to be transported or requisitioned from local populations. The administrative complexity of these planning processes is revealed in the surviving records from the Mongol campaigns against the Jin dynasty in northern China during the 1210s and 1220s. campaign planners had to coordinate the movement of multiple tumens along different routes while ensuring that each force would have access to adequate supplies throughout their advance. This required detailed mapping of water sources, systematic evaluation of forage quality in different seasons, calculation of the carrying capacity of different types of terrain, and contingency planning for weather conditions that might affect the availability of natural resources. The paperwork generated by these planning processes was staggering in its detail and scope. Supply officers maintained comprehensive inventories of available resources, detailed schedules for the delivery of supplemental supplies to forward positions, and complex calculation charts that helped field commanders determine their daily resource requirements based on factors like weather conditions, terrain difficulty, combat intensity, and the condition of their animals. These administrative documents reveal a level of systematic planning that contradicts the popular image of Mongol warfare as a series of spontaneous raids by undisciplined nomadic warriors. But the logistical challenges of maintaining military effectiveness extended far beyond basic supply requirements. Mongol military success depended on their ability to coordinate the movements of multiple independent forces across enormous distances while maintaining communication between units, and ensuring that individual commanders could adapt their tactical decisions to changing strategic circumstances. This required the development of communication systems that could function reliably across the vast distances and diverse terrain conditions that characterized Mongol campaigns. The Yam postal system that provided strategic communication for imperial administration was supplemented during military campaigns by specialized field communication networks that could coordinate tactical operations in real time. These networks used a combination of signal flags, horn calls, messenger riders, and signal fires to maintain contact between different units during battle and to coordinate complex maneuvers that required precise timing and coordination. Managing these communication systems required specialized personnel who understood the technical details of signal protocols, the geographical knowledge needed to position relay stations effectively, and the administrative procedures needed to maintain reliable communications despite the chaos and confusion of active military operations. The equipment maintenance requirements of Mongol military forces created equally complex logistical challenges that required systematic solutions. Each warrior carried multiple composite bows, several types of arrows designed for different tactical situations, various weapons for close combat, protective armor, and the specialized tools needed to maintain and repair this equipment in field conditions. Maintaining this equipment in combat-ready condition required access to replacement parts, raw materials for field repairs, and the skilled craftsmen who could perform complex maintenance procedures. Mongol military forces solved these maintenance challenges by incorporating specialized craft units into their organizational structure. These units included bowyeers who could repair composite bows and manufacture replacement arrows, armorers who maintained protective equipment and weapons, farriers who could shoe horses and treat injuries, and the various craftsmen whose skills were needed to keep military equipment functioning effectively. These specialists required their own supply chains that could provide the raw materials, tools, and workshop facilities needed for their work, adding another layer of complexity to the overall logistical system. The administrative procedures needed to coordinate these various logistical systems required the development of new categories of military specialists who could manage complex supply chains while adapting to the fluid conditions of active military campaigns. These logistics officers, recruited primarily from sedentary civilizations that had experience with complex administrative systems, had to master both traditional Mongol military procedures and the systematic supply management techniques that large-scale military operations required. The surviving administrative records from Mongol military campaigns revealed the extraordinary attention to detail that effective logistics required. Supply officers maintained comprehensive inventories that tracked thousands of individual items, From basic foodstuffs and horse fodder to specialized equipment like siege engines and their component parts, they developed standardized requisition procedures that allowed field commanders to request specific supplies while providing supply officers with the information needed to plan delivery schedules. They created accountability systems that tracked the distribution and use of supplies, too, prevent waste and identify potential supply shortages before they became critical. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of Mongol logistics was the systematic approach to intelligence gathering that allowed military planners to adapt their supply requirements to the specific conditions they would encounter in different campaign theaters. This intelligence system collected detailed information about enemy military capabilities, local economic resources, seasonal weather patterns, and the political conditions that might affect the availability of supplies from local populations or allied forces. This intelligence gathering required the development of extensive networks of scouts, spies, merchants, and diplomatic agents who could provide reliable information about conditions in target territories. These intelligence networks had to be coordinated and managed through systematic administrative procedures that could evaluate the reliability of different sources, compile comprehensive intelligence summaries, and distribute this information to the military commanders who needed it for operational planning. How would these sophisticated logistical systems adapt to the challenges of siege warfare, where traditional nomadic mobility advantages became liabilities and success depended on the ability to maintain military effectiveness during prolonged static operations that might last for months or even years? The transition from mobile steppe warfare to systematic siege operations required the Mongol military machine to develop entirely new categories of logistical expertise and administrative procedures. Traditional nomadic warfare had been based on mobility, speed, and the ability to live off the land while avoiding prolonged engagements that might allow enemies to concentrate their forces. Siege warfare, by contrast, required armies to remain in fixed positions for extended periods while maintaining their combat effectiveness, despite the logistical challenges of supplying large forces in static positions and the technical complexities of breaching fortified positions that had been designed to resist exactly this type of attack. The Mongol siege of Shenyang and Fancheng from 1268 to 1273 provides detailed documentation of the administrative innovations that siege warfare required. These twin fortress cities controlled the strategic Yangtze River crossing that represented the key to Mongol expansion into southern China. But their sophisticated fortifications and access to waterborne supply lines made traditional nomadic assault tactics completely ineffective. The Mongol response required the development of new military technologies, specialized engineering units, and the complex administrative systems needed to coordinate a multi-year siege operation that would ultimately involve more 100,000 troops and an enormous supporting infrastructure. The logistical challenges of maintaining such a large force in a fixed position for an extended period required administrative innovations that had no precedent in traditional nomadic warfare. The army had to be supplied with food, fodder, equipment, and raw materials through supply lines that stretched back hundreds of miles to secure base areas, while the siege operations themselves required specialized equipment, including siege engines, naval vessels, and the various engineering tools needed for fortress warfare. Managing these supply requirements required the development of new administrative structures that could coordinate the activities of multiple supply chains while adapting to the changing tactical requirements of a prolonged siege. The administrative records from the Shenyang siege revealed the complexity of these logistical operations. Supply officers maintained detailed inventories of siege equipment that included dozens of different types of catapults and trebuchets, specialized tools for undermining fortress walls, naval vessels designed for river warfare, and the various engineering materials needed for constructing siege works and maintaining equipment in field conditions. Each category of equipment required its own supply chain with specialized procurement procedures, transportation arrangements, and maintenance schedules that had to be coordinated with overall operational planning. The siege also required the development of new categories of technical specialists who could design and operate the sophisticated engineering equipment that fortress warfare demanded. The famous Muslim engineers from Persia and Syria, who built the counterweight trebuchets that finally breached. Xiangyang's walls were part of a much larger technical infrastructure that included Chinese engineers who designed naval vessels and river-blocking devices, craftsmen who manufactured siege equipment and ammunition, and the various support personnel who maintained this equipment under combat conditions. Coordinating the activities of these diverse technical specialists required new administrative procedures that could integrate their work with traditional Mongol military organization while ensuring that their specialized requirements for materials, tools, and workshop facilities were met despite the logistical constraints of siege operations. This integration process was complicated by cultural and linguistic differences between Mongol military commanders and the foreign engineers and craftsmen, whose expertise was essential for siege success. The naval aspects of the Xiangyang siege created particularly complex logistical challenges that required the Mongol military to develop capabilities that had no precedent in traditional steppe warfare. Controlling the Yangtze River approaches to the besieged cities required the construction and maintenance of a fleet that could challenge Chinese naval forces while supporting the land-based siege operations. This naval component required specialized vessels, trained crews, and the complex support infrastructure needed to maintain ships and equipment in active combat conditions. The administrative records show that the Mongol Navy for the Xiangyang siege included several different types of vessels designed for specific tactical roles. Large warships carried siege engines and served as floating artillery platforms that could bombard fortress walls from the river. Smaller, faster vessels were used for patrol duties and intercepting supply shipments attempting to reach the besieged cities. Specialized engineering ships carried equipment for constructing obstacles and barriers that could block river traffic, while supply vessels maintained the logistical connection between the siege army and its base areas. Managing this diverse naval force required administrative procedures that were completely foreign to traditional Mongol military organization. Naval operations required detailed coordination of tides, weather conditions, and river currents that affected tactical planning in ways that had no equivalent in land-based warfare. Maintaining ships and equipment in combat-ready condition required specialized technical knowledge and support facilities that were completely different from the relatively simple maintenance requirements of horse-based military forces. The siege of Xiangyang also required the development of new intelligence-gathering procedures that could provide detailed information about the internal conditions of besieged cities and the effectiveness of siege operations. Traditional nomadic warfare had relied primarily on strategic intelligence about enemy movements and intentions. But siege warfare required tactical intelligence about fortress construction, defender capabilities, supply situations, and the morale conditions that might affect the defenders' willingness to continue resistance. This intelligence gathering required the development of new sources and methods that could penetrate the security measures that protected besieged cities. Mongol intelligence officers recruited informants among the civilian populations of besieged cities, established communication networks that could maintain contact with agents inside fortress walls, and developed interrogation procedures that could extract useful information from prisoners and deserters. These intelligence operations required their own administrative support systems, including secure communication procedures, safe houses for agents and informants, and the various resources needed to support covert operations. The financial costs of prolonged siege operations created administrative challenges that were unprecedented in traditional nomadic warfare. Mobile campaigns could largely live off the land through foraging and raiding. But siege operations required enormous investments, in specialized equipment, technical personnel, and the extended supply operations needed to maintain large forces in fixed positions. The Shenyang siege reportedly cost the Mongol Empire more than any previous military operation, requiring new approaches to military finance and resource allocation that would have lasting effects on imperial administration. These financial requirements forced Mongol administrators to develop new taxation and resource extraction procedures that could support the enormous costs of siege warfare while maintaining the other military and administrative obligations of imperial governance. This involved detailed negotiations with the various khanates and administrative regions that were expected to contribute resources to siege operations, along with the development of new accounting procedures that could track the allocation and use of these resources. The success of the Shenyang siege demonstrated the effectiveness of these administrative innovations, but it also revealed the enormous resource requirements that systematic siege warfare would place on imperial administration. As the Mongol Empire expanded to include more heavily fortified territories, the administrative burden of siege operations would become an increasingly significant factor in military planning and resource allocation. How would these complex administrative systems for siege warfare adapt to the challenges of governing conquered territories? And what administrative innovations would be required to manage the transition from military conquest to civilian administration in the diverse territories that comprised the Mongol Empire? The most complex administrative challenge facing the Mongol Empire wasn't conquest itself, but the systematic transformation of military occupation into stable civilian governance that could extract sufficient resources to support continued expansion, while maintaining political stability in territories that encompassed dozens of different ethnic groups, religious traditions, economic systems, and governmental structures. This transformation required the development of entirely new categories of administrative expertise that could bridge the gap between nomadic military organization and the sophisticated civilian processes needed to manage sedentary populations. The administrative records from the Yuan dynasty in China provide the most detailed documentation of this transformation process. When Kublai Khan established his administration in Beijing in the 1260s, he inherited a Chinese governmental system that had evolved over centuries to manage an agricultural economy, urban commercial centers, and the complex social hierarchies that characterized Chinese civilization. Rather than dismantling these established systems, Mongol administrators developed hybrid governmental structures that could maintain the effectiveness of Chinese bureaucratic procedures while integrating them into the broader framework of imperial Mongol administration. This integration process required detailed negotiations between Mongol officials and Chinese administrators regarding the specific procedures that would govern their ongoing relationship. Chinese officials had to learn new reporting requirements that would keep Mongol commanders informed about local conditions, while Mongol administrators had to develop new oversight procedures that could monitor the performance of civilian bureaucrats without disrupting the complex administrative relationships that kept Chinese society functioning. These negotiations often took months to complete and required the development of new administrative forms, communication protocols, and accountability procedures that could accommodate both Mongol and Chinese administrative traditions. The paper money system that Kublai Khan implemented throughout his territories illustrates the administrative sophistication that this integration process required. The Yuan dynasty's paper currency was backed by silver reserves and represented the first systematic attempt in world history to create a precious metal-backed paper money system that could function across vast territories with diverse economic conditions. This innovation required the development of new banking procedures, currency exchange mechanisms, and the complex regulatory systems needed to maintain public confidence in paper money, while preventing the counterfeiting and inflation that had plagued previous experiments with paper currency. Managing this currency system required specialized administrative personnel who understood both monetary theory and the practical challenges of maintaining stable exchange rates across territories. With different economic conditions, currency administrators had to monitor silver reserves, regulate the printing and distribution of paper money, coordinate exchange rates between different regions, and develop anti-counterfeiting measures that could protect the integrity of the currency system. These administrative responsibilities required continuous coordination between different levels of government and regular communication with commercial and banking institutions throughout the empire. The tax collection systems that supported imperial finances reveal similar administrative complexity. The Mongol Empire had to develop revenue collection procedures that could effectively extract resources from territories with radically different economic structures while maintaining the incentives needed for continued economic productivity. In agricultural regions, this involved working with established taxation systems that were based on land ownership and crop yields. In commercial centers, it required developing new procedures for taxing trade, manufacturing, and the various service industries that characterized urban economies. These diverse taxation requirements force Mongol administrators to develop new categories of financial expertise that could evaluate different types of economic activity and design taxation procedures that could extract optimal revenue without disrupting the economic relationships that generated taxable wealth. Tax administrators had to understand agricultural cycles, commercial practices, manufacturing processes, and the complex financial relationships that connected different sectors of the economy. They had to develop assessment procedures that could fairly evaluate taxable assets while maintaining the detailed records needed for effective tax collection and enforcement. The legal systems that governed imperial administration created even more complex challenges that required systematic solutions. The yasa that had served as an effective legal code for nomadic military forces was completely inadequate for managing the civil legal relationships that characterized sedentary societies. Issues like property rights, commercial contracts, inheritance laws, and civil disputes required specialized legal expertise that could navigate the intricate precedents and procedures that had evolved within each conquered territory, rather than attempting to replace these established legal systems with nomadic alternatives. Mongol administrators developed multi-tiered judicial structures that allowed local legal traditions to continue functioning while ensuring that imperial interests were protected. This required the training of new categories of legal officials who could interpret local laws according to imperial policy guidelines, along with the development of appeals procedures that could resolve conflicts between different legal systems operating within the same administrative territory. The religious administration policies that the Mongol Empire developed represent perhaps the most sophisticated example of this administrative approach to managing diversity. Rather than attempting to impose religious uniformity, imperial administrators created systematic procedures for managing religious diversity that could accommodate dozens of different religious traditions, while maintaining imperial authority and preventing religious conflicts that might threaten political stability. This approach required detailed negotiations with religious leaders from various traditions regarding their specific rights and obligations under imperial administration. Religious institutions received tax exemptions and governmental protection in exchange for political loyalty and cooperation with imperial policies. Religious leaders were required to register with imperial authorities and submit to basic oversight procedures that ensured their institutions weren't being used for subversive political activities while being allowed to maintain their traditional religious practices and organizational structures. The administrative complexity of these policies required specialized personnel who could serve as intermediaries between imperial officials and religious leaders from different traditions. These administrators had to understand the theological principles, organizational structures, and political concerns of various religious groups while maintaining their primary loyalty to imperial interests. They had to develop diplomatic skills that could resolve conflicts between different religious groups, while preventing these conflicts from escalating into broader political challenges to imperial authority. The postal and communication systems that connected these diverse administrative structures represent the technological and organizational achievement that made effective imperial governance possible. The Yam postal system that had been developed. To support military campaigns was expanded and refined to provide the comprehensive communication network that civilian administration required. This expansion required the establishment of thousands of additional relay stations, the training of specialized communication personnel, and the development of new procedures for handling the enormous volume of administrative correspondence that imperial governance generated. But even as these administrative innovations enabled the Mongol Empire to achieve unprecedented levels of governmental effectiveness and territorial control, they also created new sources of institutional vulnerability that would eventually threaten the empire's survival. The complex bureaucratic systems that made imperial governance possible required constant maintenance, periodic reform, and careful coordination between different levels of administration that became increasingly difficult to maintain as the empire expanded and matured. What specific administrative failures would prove most destructive to imperial unity? And how would the bureaucratic systems that had enabled conquest and expansion ultimately contribute to the succession disputes and regional fragmentation that would end the Mongol Empire's dominance of Eurasian politics? The death of Mongol Khan in 1259 precipitated an administrative crisis that would ultimately prove more destructive to the Mongol Empire than any military defeat. The succession dispute between his brothers Kublai and Arik Beyku wasn't simply a personal conflict between rival claimants, but a fundamental breakdown in the institutional procedures that had governed imperial administration since the time of Genghis Khan. The Kurultai system that had served as the empire's constitutional framework for selecting new rulers proved completely inadequate for managing succession in an empire that had grown beyond the traditional boundaries of steppe politics and now encompassed territories with radically different governmental expectations and administrative requirements. The administrative complexity of organizing a Kurultai for an empire that stretched from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean reveals the institutional challenges that imperial expansion had created. Traditional Kurultai had been relatively simple affairs, involving the leaders of closely related tribal groups, who could gather at a single location to debate succession questions and reach consensus through established diplomatic procedures. But by 1259, the Mongol Empire included dozens of different ethnic groups, religious traditions, and governmental systems that had no experience with nomadic political procedures and no clear stake in debates over tribal leadership succession. The practical impossibility of convening a truly representative Kurultai for such a diverse empire forced the succession process to devolve into competing regional assemblies that reflected the political fragmentation that imperial expansion had created, rather than resolved. Kublai's Kurultai, held in his base territories in northern China, was dominated by Chinese administrators and Mongol officials who had adapted to Chinese governmental procedures. Arik Bey's Kurultai, convened in the traditional Mongol heartland, represented the interests of traditional nomadic groups who feared that the empire's expansion into sedentary territories was undermining the cultural and political principles that had originally made Mongol success possible. These competing Kurultai revealed fundamental disagreements about the administrative direction that the empire should take in managing the challenges of governing diverse populations across vast territories. Kublai's supporters argued that effective imperial governance required continued adaptation to the governmental procedures that had proven successful in managing sedentary populations, including the development of permanent capital cities, sophisticated taxation systems, and the professional bureaucracies that could coordinate policies across territories with different economic and social structures. Arik Bey's supporters maintained that these administrative innovations were corrupting traditional Mongol values and creating governmental systems that were too complex and expensive to maintain over the long term. The 4-year civil war that followed this succession dispute consumed enormous administrative resources that had previously been available for imperial expansion and governmental development. Both sides had to divert resources from civilian administration to military operations, disrupting the carefully balanced taxation and supply systems that sustained imperial governance. The administrative personnel who had managed the complex procedures needed for effective imperial government found themselves forced to choose sides in a conflict that threatened to destroy the institutional framework they had spent decades developing and refining. The resolution of this succession crisis through Kublai's victory and his establishment of the Yuan dynasty marked the beginning of a new phase of imperial administration that was fundamentally different from the unified governmental system that Ched had characterized the earlier period of Mongol expansion. Rather than a single imperial administration coordinating policies across all Mongol territories, the empire effectively fragmented into 4 separate khanates that maintained nominal allegiance to the Yuan dynasty while developing independent administrative systems adapted to their specific territorial and population characteristics. This administrative fragmentation created new challenges for maintaining the communication and coordination systems that had made effective imperial governance possible. The Yam postal system that had connected all parts of the empire under centralized administration became increasingly unreliable as political relationships between the different khanates deteriorated. Regional administrators who had previously reported to a single imperial authority now had to navigate competing loyalty demands from different khanate governments, creating confusion and inefficiency in administrative procedures that had previously functioned smoothly. The taxation systems that had supported imperial finances became increasingly problematic, as the different khanates developed independent fiscal policies that sometimes conflicted with the broader imperial interests that had originally justified their tax collection authority. Regional administrators found themselves pressed to meet competing revenue demands from both their immediate khanate governments and the distant Yuan imperial administration, creating administrative conflicts that reduced the overall effectiveness of imperial tax collection, while increasing the burden on local populations. The legal systems that governed imperial administration faced similar challenges as the different khanates began developing independent judicial procedures that sometimes conflicted with the unified legal framework that had previously provided consistency across the empire. Legal officials who had been trained to apply imperial legal standards found themselves forced to adapt to new general legal requirements that might contradict their previous training and experience, creating inconsistency and confusion in legal proceedings that had previously been managed according to Rc. Only Ruby Kiss has the luxurious texture that glides on leaf stee. You know, my lysine carry, my lysie, and Lee's long-lasting color, while lysine carry in my ness. Lies carry, carries, lies carry, EKK carry. My lies carry, lies K, psyche say. My cases, L, K, my whaley K lad, my sawag, by lies. But we're so lies sit. We agreed it. Kada seely slide kakape me psychasic skillies read guy kylisis cassette lisa gan gus standardized imperial procedures, the religious administration policies that had successfully managed religious diversity under unified imperial government became increasingly difficult to maintain as the different khanates developed different approaches to religious questions that reflected their specific population characteristics and political requirements. The Golden Horde's gradual conversion to Islam, the Yuan dynasty's support for Buddhism and traditional Chinese religious practices, And the Ilkhanate's complex relationship with Islamic institutions created religious policy conflicts that made it increasingly difficult to maintain the consistent approach to religious administration that had previously characterized imperial governance. These administrative challenges were compounded by the generational changes that affected imperial governance as the original Mongol administrators who had developed the empire's institutional systems were replaced by officials who had grown up within the imperial bureaucracy, rather than experiencing the conquest period that had originally created these systems. These second and third generation administrators often lacked the political flexibility and institutional creativity that had characterized the original generation of Mongol leaders, making them less capable of adapting imperial institutions to changing political circumstances. The increasing reliance on regional administrators from conquered populations, while necessary for managing the complex governmental requirements of sedentary territories, also created new sources of institutional vulnerability. These administrators, while technically loyal to imperial interests, naturally developed stronger connections to their immediate regional constituencies than to the distant imperial government. This gradual localization of administrative loyalty made it increasingly difficult for central imperial authorities to maintain effective oversight of regional governmental operations. The communication systems that had enabled effective central coordination of imperial administration became increasingly strained as the empire expanded and administrative requirements became more complex. The volume of administrative correspondence required for effective imperial governance had grown beyond the capacity of the YAM system to handle efficiently, creating delays and communication failures that reduced the effectiveness of central government oversight. Regional administrators found themselves making important policy decisions without current guidance from central authorities, leading to increasing inconsistency in imperial administration across different territories. How would these mounting administrative challenges interact with the economic pressures and external threats that would ultimately overwhelm the institutional systems that had made the Mongol Empire possible? And what specific bureaucratic failures would prove most decisive in the empire's eventual fragmentation and decline? The administrative innovations that had enabled the Mongol Empire to achieve unprecedented territorial expansion and governmental effectiveness ultimately became sources of institutional vulnerability as the economic costs of maintaining complex bureaucratic systems exceeded the empire's ability to generate sufficient revenue through taxation and tribute collection. The sophisticated administrative apparatus that had made imperial governance possible required enormous ongoing investments in personnel, communication systems, military forces, and the various governmental services that sustained imperial authority. While the territories under imperial control faced increasing economic pressures that reduced their ability to support these administrative costs, the paper money system that Kublai Khan had implemented as a solution to the empire's currency and taxation challenges illustrates how administrative innovations could become sources of systemic instability. The Yuan dynasty's paper currency had initially succeeded because it was backed by silver reserves and supported by the empire's ability to enforce acceptance through governmental authority. But maintaining this system required constant attention to the balance between currency issuance and silver reserves, along with sophisticated regulatory procedures that could prevent counterfeiting and maintain public confidence in paper money. As the empire's administrative costs increased and its military expenses grew due to ongoing conflicts with neighboring powers and internal rebellions, the Yuan administration faced increasing pressure to issue additional paper money to meet governmental revenue requirements. Each increase in currency issuance reduced the silver backing behind individual notes, creating inflationary pressures that gradually undermined public confidence in the currency system. By the 1340s, the administrative records show that paper money had lost most of its purchasing power, forcing the government to resort to increasingly desperate measures to maintain fiscal stability. The administrative challenges of managing currency devaluation created cascading problems throughout. The imperial governmental system. Regional administrators found their salaries and operational budgets inadequate for meeting their administrative responsibilities, forcing them to resort to additional taxation or corruption that further reduced public support for imperial governance. Military forces faced similar problems as their pay and supply budgets became insufficient for maintaining combat effectiveness, leading to desertion, mutiny, and the gradual breakdown of imperial military authority. The taxation systems that had sustained imperial finances became increasingly ineffective as economic conditions deteriorated and regional administrators lost the authority needed for effective tax collection. The complex administrative procedures that had enabled systematic revenue collection during the empire's expansion period required stable political conditions and public cooperation that became increasingly difficult to maintain as imperial authority weakened. Regional populations that had previously accepted imperial taxation as the price of governmental services and military protection began to resist tax collection efforts as these services deteriorated and imperial military protection became unreliable. The administrative records from the later Yuan period revealed the extent to which governmental effectiveness had declined due to these economic pressures. Tax collection rates fell dramatically across most imperial territories, while administrative costs continued to increase due to the need to maintain larger military forces to suppress rebellions and defend against external threats. Regional administrators found themselves caught between central government demands for increased revenue and local populations that lacked the economic resources to meet these demands, creating administrative conflicts that further reduced governmental effectiveness. The trade and commercial systems that had provided much of the empire's economic dynamism during its expansion period also faced increasing challenges as imperial authority weakened and communication systems became less reliable. The Pax Mongolica that had enabled unprecedented commercial expansion across Eurasia depended on imperial ability to maintain secure trade routes, enforce commercial agreements, and provide the diplomatic coordination needed for international commerce. As these governmental services deteriorated, merchants and commercial organizations began to develop alternative arrangements that bypassed imperial administrative systems, reducing the empire's access to commercial taxation revenue. The administrative costs of maintaining the Yam postal system, which had been crucial for effective imperial governance, became increasingly difficult to justify as the system's reliability declined. An alternative communication methods became available. Regional administrators found that maintaining Yam stations and supporting postal operations consumed resources that were desperately needed for other governmental functions. While the system's effectiveness had declined to the point where important communications were often delayed or lost entirely, this created a feedback loop where reduced investment in communication systems further weakened imperial coordination, leading to additional administrative failures that justified further reductions in communication system support. The religious administration policies that had successfully managed religious diversity during the empire's expansion period became sources of additional administrative burden as economic pressures forced imperial administrators to reduce the tax exemptions and governmental support that had previously been provided to religious institutions. Religious leaders who had previously supported imperial authority, exchange for governmental protection and financial benefits, began to withdraw their cooperation as these benefits were reduced, creating new sources of political opposition that required additional military and administrative resources to manage. The military expenses required for defending the empire's extensive borders and suppressing internal rebellions consumed an increasing portion of imperial resources, leaving less available for the civilian administrative functions that sustained governmental effectiveness. The professional military forces that had enabled imperial expansion required regular pay, equipment and logistical support that became increasingly difficult to provide as imperial finances deteriorated. Military commanders found themselves forced to resort to plunder and unauthorized taxation to maintain their forces, creating additional conflicts with civilian administrators and further reducing public support for imperial governance. The administrative personnel systems that had enabled effective imperial governance faced similar challenges as economic pressures made it increasingly difficult to attract and retain qualified administrators. The complex governmental procedures that imperial administration required could only be performed by trained professionals who expected adequate compensation for their specialized skills. But imperial finances no longer provided sufficient resources for maintaining competitive salary systems. This led to a gradual decline in administrative quality as experienced personnel left imperial services and were replaced by less qualified administrators who lacked the skills needed for effective governmental management. The census and population registration systems that had provided the detailed information needed for effective taxation and military recruitment became increasingly unreliable as regional populations sought to avoid imperial oversight and administrators lacked the resources needed for systematic data collection. Without accurate population and economic data, imperial administrators found it increasingly difficult to develop realistic revenue projections or coordinate policies across different regions, leading to planning failures that further reduced governmental effectiveness. These mounting economic pressures created institutional stress that exceeded the adaptive capacity of even the most sophisticated administrative systems that the empire had developed. The governmental innovations that had enabled unprecedented territorial control and administrative effectiveness required stable economic conditions and public cooperation that were no longer available, creating systemic failures that would ultimately prove more destructive than any military defeat. What specific administrative breakdowns would prove most decisive in the empire's fragmentation? And how would the institutional systems that had created the world's largest empire ultimately contribute to its division into smaller, more manageable political units? The final collapse of unified Mongol imperial authority wasn't a dramatic military defeat or sudden political revolution, but rather a gradual administrative dissolution that occurred as the institutional systems that had made imperial governance possible proved unable to adapt to the mounting economic pressures, communication failures, and political conflicts that had accumulated over decades of imperial expansion. The bureaucratic innovations that had enabled the creation of history's largest contiguous empire ultimately became sources of institutional paralysis, as they required resources and coordination capabilities that no longer existed. The administrative records from the 1340s and 1350s reveal the extent to which imperial governmental systems had become dysfunctional despite maintaining their formal institutional structures. The Yuan administration in Beijing continued to issue orders and policy directives to regional administrators throughout the empire, but these communications often went unanswered or were implemented in ways that contradicted central government intentions. Regional administrators maintained their formal titles and administrative positions, but their actual authority had become largely limited to their immediate territorial base, making empire-wide policy coordination impossible. The Yam postal system that had been the nervous system of imperial administration provides a particularly clear example of this institutional decay. The system's formal structure remained intact, with relay stations continuing to operate and postal administrators maintaining their official positions. But the system's effectiveness had declined to the point where important communications often took months to reach their intended destinations, if they arrived at all. Regional administrators who had previously relied on regular communication with central authorities found themselves forced to make important policy decisions without current guidance, leading to increasing inconsistency in imperial administration. Across different territories, the taxation systems that had sustained imperial finances illustrate similar institutional dysfunction. Tax collection procedures continued to follow established administrative protocols, with regional officials submitting regular reports on revenue collection to central authorities and maintaining detailed records of tax assessments and collection rates. But actual tax collection had declined dramatically across most imperial territories. While the administrative costs of maintaining tax collection systems had continued to increase, the result was a governmental system that consumed enormous resources while generating insufficient revenue to sustain its operations. The military forces that had originally created the empire and sustained its expansion faced even more severe institutional challenges as imperial authority weakened. The decimal organizational system that had made Mongol military forces uniquely effective continued to exist as a formal administrative structure. But the resources needed to maintain combat-ready units were no longer available. Military commanders found themselves forced to choose between maintaining their official positions within the imperial hierarchy and developing independent sources of support that could sustain their forces, leading to the gradual transformation of imperial military units into regional warlord armies that owed only nominal allegiance to central imperial authority. The legal systems that had provided consistency in imperial administration across diverse territories became increasingly fragmented as regional administrators developed independent judicial procedures that reflected their immediate political needs rather than empire-wide legal standards. The multi-tiered legal structure that had successfully accommodated local legal traditions within an imperial framework gradually broke down as central authority weakened, and regional legal officials found themselves accountable primarily to local political authorities rather than distant imperial administrators. The religious administration policies that had pre-managed religious diversity throughout the empire's expansion period became sources of additional political fragmentation as different regions developed independent relationships with religious institutions that reflected their specific population characteristics and political requirements. The systematic approach to religious administration that had prevented religious conflicts from becoming political challenges to imperial authority gave way to regional religious policies that often contradicted imperial guidelines and created new sources of internal conflict. Perhaps most significantly, the administrative personnel systems that had enabled effective imperial governance suffered from a generational crisis as the officials who had developed and maintained the empire's institutional systems reached the end of their careers without adequate provision for transferring their specialized knowledge to successor administrators. The complex governmental procedures that imperial administration required could only be performed by experienced professionals who understood both the formal administrative protocols and the informal coordination mechanisms that made these systems function effectively in practice. The training and development systems that had previously ensured continuity in administrative expertise had been disrupted by the economic pressures and political conflicts that characterized the empire's later period. Experienced administrators found themselves overwhelmed by crisis management responsibilities that left little time for training successor personnel, while the resources needed for systematic administrator development were diverted to more immediate governmental needs. The result was a gradual decline in administrative competence that made it increasingly difficult to maintain the complex coordination required for effective imperial governance. The communication systems that had enabled central coordination of imperial administration became increasingly unreliable as economic pressures forced reductions in system maintenance and political conflicts made internal communication more difficult. Regional administrators who had previously maintained regular contact with their counterparts in other territories found themselves increasingly isolated, leading to policy divergence that made empire-wide coordination impossible even when central authorities attempted to maintain unified administrative standards. The census and population registration systems that had provided the detailed information needed for effective imperial governance became increasingly outdated as regional populations sought to avoid imperial oversight and administrators lacked the resources needed for systematic data collection updates. Without current information about population distributions, economic conditions, and resource availability, central imperial authorities found it impossible to develop realistic policies or coordinate resource allocation across different regions. These systemic administrative failures created a feedback loop where reduced governmental effectiveness led to further reductions in public support and resource availability, which in turn led to additional administrative failures that further weakened imperial authority. By the 1350s, the institutional systems that had made the Mongol Empire possible had become so dysfunctional that maintaining imperial unity required more resources than the empire could generate, making political fragmentation inevitable regardless of the intentions or capabilities of individual leaders. The transformation of the unified Mongol Empire into the separate Yuan, Golden Horde, Ilkhanate, and Chagatai successor states wasn't the result of successful rebellions or foreign conquests, but rather the administrative recognition that imperial governmental systems had become too complex and expensive to maintain across such vast and diverse territories. The governmental innovations that had enabled unprecedented territorial expansion and administrative effectiveness had ultimately created institutional requirements that exceeded the organizational and economic capabilities of any medieval political system. The legacy of these administrative innovations would continue to influence governmental development throughout Eurasia for centuries after the empire's fragmentation, as the successor states and neighboring powers adapted Mongol governmental techniques to their own political needs. But the Mongol Empire itself had discovered the fundamental limitation that would constrain all imperial systems: that governmental effectiveness ultimately depends on maintaining a sustainable balance between administrative capabilities and territorial scope, and that institutional innovations alone cannot overcome the basic economic and organizational constraints that limit the size and durability of political systems. The boring administrative details that had made the Mongol Empire possible: the census records, tax collection procedures, communication protocols, and bureaucratic coordination mechanisms had ultimately become the empire's greatest weakness, requiring resources and expertise that could not be maintained indefinitely across territories that encompassed most of the known world. In the end, the world's largest empire was defeated not by enemy armies or popular rebellions, but by the mundane mathematics of imperial administration that proved that even the most sophisticated governmental systems have natural limits that cannot be exceeded without risking systematic institutional collapse. And so concludes the entire story of the Mongol Empire, with the clash of swords or the thunder of hooves, but with the quiet scratching of quills on parchment, the patient counting of census figures, and the gradual accumulation of administrative burdens that would ultimately prove more decisive than any battlefield victory. In its rise and fall, we see the eternal tension between human ambition and institutional capability, between the dream of universal empire and the practical limitations of governmental systems that must, ultimately answer to the mundane requirements of daily administration. Perhaps there is comfort in knowing that even history's greatest conquerors were ultimately constrained by the same bureaucratic realities that govern our own more modest endeavors, that empires, like all human institutions, must eventually yield to the quiet but inexorable demands of practical administration and sustainable governance.